So you are really studying people, right? This is really a study of the individuals involved. I would love your take on what you've learned through your research about people in times of conflict, and who are some of the personality types that I don't know, lend themselves more to finding compromise, and then the personality types that are just hell bent on conflict to the end. So much of this is the study of people, and I love your take on if there's a certain type of leader that you see that's more likely than not to find those pieces of compromise, and maybe what that tells us about the world that we see now and the kind of leaders who we would need to turn to have these agreements be put in place.
Wow, it's a tricky question. I mean, I love the way you put it though, Brian. I mean, I think that's spot on in terms of my research really is about people, and it's tried to, like I said at the beginning when I acknowledged the traditional custodians here of this land. I mean, I think it's so important to think. I think too often we get caught up, especially us, in the West and in the international community, uh, get caught up with sort of very much this high level analysis, either whether it's a geopolitical analysis, Israel did this, Iran did this, Syria did this, Russia did this, the mediators did that. And we don't think about the people really affected by what's going on the ground. So, if anything, my research is really a call to kind of refocus and to think about how these things that we call ceasefire agreements affect people on the ground. Um, One thing I'll say that in times of conflict, people are amazing. I mean, people, like I said to you before, life continues during conflict. I mean, amazingly and quite inspiringly, people find people's will to survive and to continue despite sometimes enormous pressures is quite amazing, quite ingenious. And so we have to kind of consider how ingenious people are in those certain circumstances and be inspired by that, I think, in many cases. In terms of whether there's people, what the kind of personality type is for making deals, or, being a good negotiator. I mean, maybe it's speaking like in a little bit of an optimistic way, but I think in some ways, look, if we, I think anyone who sort of can some that has knowledge of their community, that has connections to their community, like real connections, but also is empathetic in terms of can understand at least to a certain extent what is happening on the other side of the equation, or sides, as in many cases. I think that's always going to be a good thing, whether it's even in interpersonal conflict, right? As we're seeing more and more these days. I think more and more empathy, the more empathy we can have and the more understanding of the kind of baggage that people bring to this moment in time is always going to be a good thing.
Well, one element of that is age. It's a little bit of a stereotype, but what you'll hear is, if you have mediators who've been around longer, leaders who've been around longer, maybe they have a more mature view of the world, of their community, that it can be easier to find an agreement there than sometimes when you have young, brash leaders trying to prove themselves. Maybe they don't have as much experience. Maybe they're a bit more radical. Does your research tell us anything about an age difference and how folks involved look at these conflicts depending on their experiences?
Often culturally, I guess age is a factor in terms of, a lot of the local leaders or people in even in our culture that we consider more wise or get these kind of positions are older, right? So that's a culturally ingrained kind of thing. But I think often in the Syria cases that I've been involved with, it's not necessarily been, older people. I mean, although sometimes it has, like sheikhs are often sort of a little bit older, for example, but a lot of the local leaders in some of the towns are probably, I would say, on the younger side, because they're sort of they, often they hold important roles in the community. I mentioned that to you already. So they're doctors or lawyers or people that are well respected for the knowledge that they bring to the community, not just in terms of conflict negotiation, but in terms of skills like teaching or things like that. And that doesn't necessarily have to be something where you need to be 50, 60. It can be something that you have when you're 25, 30, and some of the best or some of really interesting local leaders that I've come across have been sort of within that age category as well.
What do you think about the idea that as you're growing up in a period of conflict, this becomes your normal, and this is what you know? Does the research that you've done, the work that you've done, the people you met, are people who grow up in conflict, who are shaped by that conflict, in some ways better positioned or worse positioned to find compromise? The stereotypes, right? What we hear in the media is that if you've been in a war zone for 10 years, 15 years of your life, and you're hardened and you've seen people pass away, and you have, maybe revenge on your mind, that the longer the conflict goes, the more you've lived in it and been raised in it, the more it perpetuates itself. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that that doesn't just exhaust you and want to get you to a period of peace. Does your research or the folks that you've talked to give you any insights one way or the other on this idea?
I think that some of those things that you've just mentioned are probably more sort of broad brushstrokes and maybe kind of stereotypes that we have of people that have experienced violence for a long time. Some of the research I'm doing currently has to do with how people understand the law in the aftermath of violence, for example, at a really everyday level. So I've been doing quite a lot of research with Syrians, just as one example, who've had experience at checkpoints in Syria. And when I say checkpoints, I define that very broadly. So, it could be a very traditional checkpoint like you and I would think about, where your car is forced into a lane and you have to show your identity documents. But it can also be an encounter between a person and state security, for example, like the police or something like that, to renew an identity document or something like that. So when I talk to Syrians about how what that experience was like for them in Syria, they talk about it in a very fear, in a very complicated way, in a very ambiguous way, about how the law and violence worked in Syria. It was very ambiguous what would happen in those situations, and that made them feel quite unsure about the outcome. And their feelings were sometimes mixed, very sort of fearful, very sad, sometimes very conflicted about how the law and violence worked in Syria. But then, when I speak to them again, and most of these people have been displaced from Syria, and now they're now in places like Australia or in Germany, different Western countries. And it's really interesting because they have these encounters with the state bureaucracy or the police in Sweden or in Germany or in Australia, and those ambiguous fears about how the law operates in those new countries travel with them. And so it's not something that just goes away. It's like very much an embodied experience. So I would say, it's not always these grand things of like, the people that I know from Syria are all traumatized because they experience these terrible bombings and violence. It's a much more granular level about how people experience everyday life and the law and governance in their new countries where they now find themselves. And I don't think that always equates to, you know, uh, trauma necessarily, or, like a terrible response to that, or, they all need psychological help. Not at all. I mean, some of them are the most resilient and kind of dignified people that I know.